Hi guys, welcome back to Behind the Sawdust, where you get an inside look at the happenings in the Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal shops. This past week, I've been working on a new homemade machine, which is like 90% of what I do these days. I have a long list of other projects Mrs. Stumpy wants, like everyone else has. I don't mean that everyone else has a list of things to do for my wife. I think it's more likely that you have a honey-do list of your own, and it's probably way longer than the number of days you have left on this earth. So how do you deal with it? Lots of excuses. And the more ridiculous they are, the better. When I was in school, I never did my homework because I didn't feel like it. But I couldn't say I didn't feel like it. The teacher would just poke me in the eye and send me to detention. But if I said my mom died, that would buy me at least a week without math homework. So when Mrs. Stumpy asks when her kitchen cabinets are going to be finished, I have a whole list of distant relatives that I can whip out and sacrifice a couple should I need to buy some extra time. And what do I spend that time on? These days, making homemade jigs and machines. The project that has consumed most of my time lately is this box joint jig. You'll see it in action in the upcoming July issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. This is my third box joint jig design, not counting the one that attaches to my table saw super sled system. Why so many box joint jigs? Because I like them. They're fun to build, they're fun to use, and they impress the ladies. And it seems like I'm not the only one who feels that way. Other YouTubers have built box joint jigs of their own. It's actually quite interesting to see how these have developed over the years. The first one I ever saw was made by Matthias over at woodgears.ca. His was brilliant. He came up with the idea of using a sliding carriage that was driven by a lead screw in a box joint jig. It's an innovation that has influenced a number of other jig designers, including myself. His jig used a system of wooden gears to control the distance that the workpiece moved between each cut. You swap out different gear combinations based on the spacing you want between the fingers of your joint. I found the idea fascinating, and it made me want to try to build my own. So back in 2012, I made my first box joint jig. I used Matthias's idea of a lead screw-driven sliding carriage, but I made some major changes. First, I used drawer slides rather than wooden tracks for the carriage. I eliminated the swappable gears in favor of a fixed 2-to-1 gear ratio. One turn of the crank moved the carriage 1/8 of an inch, 2 turns 1/4 of an inch, and so on. I also created a quick release mechanism that would allow you to move the carriage back to the start position quickly. And you could lock that quick release in the open position, and that allowed you to move the carriage by hand without the crank, which enabled me to add a template feature as a secondary option if you don't want to count crank turns. And finally, I added an adjustable fence to help prevent the workpieces from shifting out of alignment as their bottom edges drag across the base of the jig as the carriage moves. In the meantime, another YouTuber named John at ibuiltit.ca was developing his own jig. He also used a sliding carriage, but instead of driving it with a threaded rod, it was entirely template driven. I liked the template idea, which is why I had put the aluminum template on my first jig, but John's was different. His template was a strip of wood with grooves cut into it that are spaced according to the joint you want to cut. A hand-operated lever latches onto the grooves, pulling the carriage the proper distance before moving on to the next groove, and so on. His carriage ran on some wooden tracks like Matthias's, although he added a piece of HDPE plastic for smoother movement. And John's carriage was also open on the front. I suspect he may have gotten that idea from Incra's iBox, which has an open carriage, but it's also just as possible that he'd never seen the iBox and came up with that feature on his own. Either way, his pattern-driven jig was a fantastic idea. During the same time, around 2012, 2013, I had begun experimenting with a homemade version of the Incra positioner. I've had Incra fences for years, and I've always liked the way that they use 2 mating pieces of threaded rod as a positioner. The idea has actually been around since the early 1900s and used in a lot of different jigs. But in the early 90s, Incra applied it to cutting box joints for the first time by providing paper template strips for their table saw and router fences. You align those strips with the threads on the rod, and you could cut accurate joints. I used one of their fences for quite a while to cut box joints. And then in 2013, I started building my own dedicated box joint jig with my own version of their positioner. Mine had an open carriage like the Incra iBox and a threaded lead screw positioner like the Incra table saw and router fences. I created my own paper template that aligns with the threads on the lead screw, making it possible to cut any joint size precisely just by moving the carriage by hand and then locking a split nut down over the threaded rod. When those two mating threads mesh together, the carriage is nudged into precisely the correct position. As long as your eyesight can get the cursor within 1/16 of an inch, the positioner will take it from there. Another thing I changed on jig number 2 was instead of using drawer slides for the carriage, I used an extruded aluminum dovetail-shaped bar that ran in a mating track on the front of the jig. The next year, in 2015, John from I Built It started designing his second box joint jig. This one featured a version of Incra's lead screw positioner, an idea that he'd also been playing with for some time as well. But he applied the idea in a different way. Rather than meshing threads together, he uses a single threaded rod and a wooden finger that catches on the threads and pulls the carriage forward, much like his first box joint jig, only he swapped out the wooden template strip for a permanently mounted threaded rod. It's set up to move the carriage in 1/8 inch increments, which is also the width of most full curve saw blades. If you want 1/4 inch fingers, you move it twice and so on. He also made some more minor changes, but the fixed lead screw, driven by a wooden lever, was the biggest one. Now, you would think that after all these different jigs, there wouldn't be much else you can improve upon. But people who were trying to build my second jig started telling me that the aluminum dovetail bar that they needed for the tracking mechanism wasn't available anymore. So I was forced to redesign it. No problem, because I already had some ideas for improving jig number 2. With jig number 3, I went back to the closed carriage design with drawer slides that I used on my first jig. The positioner on jig number 3 is pretty much the same one that I used on jig number 2, but I beefed up the latch mechanism to eliminate any lateral movement, and I upgraded the threaded rod from 3/8 of an inch to 1 inch because the coarse threads mesh together much better than the finer ones. Of course, using 1-inch rod was John's idea, and it was a good one. But rather than using a lever to move the rod, I stuck with the age-old meshing threads idea that I'd used in my previous jig and that Incra and so many others have used over the years. And rather than permanently mounting the rod, I made mine so that it will rotate using a crank on the end. This means the jig can be operated in 2 different ways. You can move it by hand or by turning the crank. There's a template which has all sorts of different joint configurations, including complex inlaid joints on it. Or you could skip the template altogether and just count crank turns like Matthias's jig or my first jig. Again, I'll show you everything in more detail in the upcoming July issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. So that's 6 box joint jigs built by 3 woodworkers over a period of about 5 years or so. And there's some other ones out there too. Some that use these same ideas, others that use spacers and all sorts of other innovations. And I suspect we're going to see more down the road. Which one's the best? Well, it depends entirely on your personal preference. Frankly, I'd build them all. Because it's not just about having a jig to cut box joints. Heck, you can make a simple jig to do that in a few minutes. But the reason why so many people like to build these complex versions is because it's fun to make something unique out of wood. Some people build whirligigs, some build automatons, some build marble machines, and some build complex jigs. These projects are fun. They give the builder a well-deserved sense of satisfaction having completed one. They're truly useful in the shop, and let's face it, they look pretty impressive when your buddies come over. Check out our homemade machines section over at stumpynubs.com for all sorts of woodworking jigs, tools, and machines that you can make yourself. In the meantime, let's head over to our homemade workshop where we put all of our homemade machines to work for a quick tip from Mustache Mike.
Hi all, Mustache Mike here. Let me ask you a question. How do you cut down a full-size sheet of sandpaper, let's say perhaps to use it on a small hand sander? Now, there's probably several ways of doing this. Quite often people will pull out the old scissors, cut the sandpaper, and then they kind of mysteriously wonder why the once sharp scissors now won't even cut warm butter. Now, others too will fold a piece of sandpaper and do the tear on the edge of the bench routine. But if you're like me, this is usually kind of the results that I get. So is there a way to accurately cut a full-size sheet of sandpaper without these disasters? Watch this tip. So making this accessory is really just a snap. You'll need a piece of wood, a hacksaw blade. I chose 24 teeth per inch. If you go to 18, it's a little coarse. I used a 12-inch blade, 2 washers and 2 drywall screws. The reason for the washers is we need a little spacer between the blade and the wood so you can get your sandpaper in. Now use is really easy. I marked my sandpaper where I wanted to cut it off. You just kind of grab the center of the blade and lift it up a little bit. Slide your sandpaper in to the width that you want. Kind of put your finger here to hold it. And just like that, sandpaper's cut to order.
In the last couple of episodes, we've been talking about how these projects that we make here come to be. We started with their conception at the computer workstation and how I'd use digital modeling software. Then we, in the last episode, talked about how that I dimension the parts from the sheet good rack through the table saw and how I use monitors throughout the shop to display that digital model and guide me along the way. This is where my process probably becomes quite a bit different from the typical woodworking shop. Mostly because we have to film and photograph everything for Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal as we work. We try to shorten the amount of time by not doing a lot of filming while we're dimensioning. I figure most people already know what a piece of plywood passing through a table saw looks like. But once the parts are dimensioned, the cameras have to start rolling. This is the assembly area. I have everything I need here. There's the flip top T-track table with the downdraft sanding station here. The big workbench, which is where most of the assembly occurs. Got sanding machines for fine-tuning the parts, and there's even a monitor here that would normally have the digital model to direct me as I work. As I'm working in this part of the workshop, I do my own filming. I have a camera set up here next to me, which is always in the way, but I'd rather deal with it myself than pay someone to just stand here all day next to me while I work. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. I used to film in HD and then take photos separately at the same time. Then I could use those photos to make the woodworking plans for other people who want to build the project. It was a little bit of a pain though, until I got a 4K camera. 4K video is 4 times the size of HD. That means that I can pull photographs out of the video itself rather than having to take video and photos separately. So it really speeds things up. But it's still a big hassle to film and build at the same time. There's so much to learn about controlling light and focus, and there's a bazillion settings on the camera that all do something different. I have to be a woodworker and a videographer at the same time, not to mention the writing and the editing and the web design and everything else that goes into publishing a digital woodworking journal. But I've been doing this longer than most YouTubers, and while I've come a long way, I still get frustrated with something in nearly every video. Part of the problem is I like to experiment with different equipment. I'm always trying to find the perfect solution that'll work for me. But all of those changes mean I have to constantly be learning new equipment, and so do the other people who work here behind the scenes. We'll talk about that more next week. It's time to wrap up this edition of Behind the Sawdust. Don't forget about our sponsors. We literally could not do what we do without them. So please visit their website just for a minute or two to look around. I'd consider it a personal favor. While you do, you can sit back and have yourself a cold one, because you've earned it, my friend.